My name is Dr. Amanda Falk. I am a partner and chief clinical officer at The Dorm, which is an IOP and PHP treatment community for young adults in both New York City and Washington, D.C. Today, I will be here as a moderator. At The Dorm, like so many other treatment programs here today, we are certainly witnessing the impact of rising cannabis potency and disordered use among young adults. And we are just so grateful to have Dr. Rocco Marotta here with us today to share his research and expert insights on cannabis stimulants and the growing rates of psychosis and overdose in young adults. For many of us, Dr. Rocco Marotta needs absolutely no introduction at all. So many of us have been impacted by you and your work in this field, which we are so grateful for. Dr. Marotta is a board-certified psychiatrist and neurologist, as well as a licensed psychologist. He serves as an assistant clinical professor at Yale University and holds a PhD in psychology and neuroscience from the City University of New York, and completed an NIH fellowship in biology, psychology, and psychiatry. For several decades, he has served patients at Silver Hill Hospital with complex neuropsychiatric conditions, and today he is the director of their Center for the Treatment and Study of Neuropsychiatric Disorders. I'd like to leave as much time as possible for Dr. Marotta's presentation and for your questions at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the presentation over to you, Dr. Marotta.
Thank you. Chair. We're just trying to get our side working. I also went to Cornell Medical School, so I had to put in a pitch for them. And I was trained at Payne Whitney. And which was a wonderful education, And there's no payment for this. I have no commercial interest in anything I'm going to speak about. So I just want to make that clear. This, the idea of giving this talk came out of a discussion with Amanda and Mindy and Dr. Doherty and others 6 months ago, before it became more an issue that's come up in the media. So, and the real idea for this is because we began seeing over the last really 6 years more and more psychosis in this, not in Payne Whitney, I'll get to that in a second, but more and more psychosis at Silver Hill in the dual diagnosis and in the other programs. And there were certain common links. So the object here is to identify some of the factors that we think are involved in not only overdosing in young adults, but the presentation of more psychosis in the way in which stimulant use and cannabis use is really changing things in our clinical practice at this level, which is a sort of a consultation and treatment level. Also, if we have time, I'll tell you what I think might be going on in the brain, because that's one of the things that's always interested me for the last 45 years. So we began seeing more and more patients appearing for psychiatric care from really severe illness. The illnesses lately have seen more forward, severe, and almost always involving concurrent substance use. We began having trouble controlling the cases with conventional medication, the first and second generation antipsychotics. So the treatment modalities and protocols became becoming more and more difficult, in my opinion, and of our general staff. We see new clusters of symptoms in patients at times, which we can get into. We've been using more and more clozapine than we ever had, because the cases are not responsive. And then more and more data is coming in from various clinical and epidemiological studies. This is coming in particularly from Scandinavia with the high levels of psychosis with cannabis, but also lots of data that has been around for a while from Asia, from Japan and China, about stimulant. effects. Now, this is an array of 30 cases. This is a part of a set of 50. These 50 cases are people, young people, almost always, that transferred to us for non-responsive psychosis, non-responsive schizophrenia, almost kind of a schizoaffective disorder. I just want to bring your attention to the center, the letters C, A, C, A, S, etc. Well, if C means that you were a heavy cannabis user and A is that you're using amphetamines and stimulants. Embedded in the data of looking at the effect of clozapine and other things was that 80% of the cases had been using stimulants and cannabis. I'm not talking about somebody having one single episode of use, but had been using over periods of time. And in their history, now in the New York metropolitan area, people have begun to use, early in high school. And more people are also being prescribed stimulants for ADD and other things. So this was part of an array of data we presented at the, the American psychiatric meetings and the addiction meetings. Well, to me, it seems like there's a problem. Why is there such a problem? Well, these are medicines, chemicals which are used for medical purposes. I mean, and now cannabis is legal in many states. It's viewed as helpful to treatment of disorders like pain, anxiety, migraines, multiple sclerosis, etc. Right? And stimulants are used to treat ADD, resistant depression, narcolepsy, autism. So it's part of the general culture, the medical culture, but it's now part of our whole cultural zeitgeist. I was raised to think of cannabis as being benign, a part of accepted culture on college campuses, music festivals, etc., social meetings, and likewise, stimulants of various kinds have always been used. Western culture is now focused on not only individual success and productivity, but also that you should relax and take it easy and do well. But there's more and more data that it can be dangerous. Again, I related that since we had our talk about putting this together, the American Journal of Psychiatry has a whole issue just in the last weeks. This is the October issue, so we're just into November, on the effect of cannabis and going over some of the data. The New York Times has had, articles on it in series. The Wall Street Journal also had a series during the summer. And so this is something that is now, I think, in a general background. I pulled a lot of this data out from various sources. And so I have to tell you, I got some of the slides from various other people, from the national reports that I'll show you copies of later on, and I have references to, also from Malta DeForte's work in London at King's College, and meeting with them in Florence at the schizophrenia meetings, Myron's group at Ottawa, and then my ability to pronounce Danish names is difficult, Cortes group in Denmark and in the groups in Finland. But just to say it up front, you can get very good data from Scandinavia because they follow people from birth to death, know all their medical history, every drug they've ever been prescribed, and all their various outcomes. So that's where you get some of the very best data. So I pulled it from them. Now, this is just a little chart I pulled out, and this is the change in the potency of cannabis in North America. And this chart starts at 1995 and goes up to 212, but I added what it is now. It's 17% on top. This one from 4 to 14%, and I put in the bottom and the far left Woodstock. I was at Woodstock. Excuse me. The potency of marijuana when I was in college was 1 to 2%, and now it is possibly above 17%. That's an enormous increase in potency. People use more, they use it more often, they use higher potency drugs, and the physician thinks in terms of potency and toxicity over time. This is one of my favorite little things I pulled out. from the London group, many of whom are of Italian background. They collect data, but all over Europe, they're connected with the common market and with the European Union. So what they did was they got the prevalence rates of the potency of cannabis. So they got an idea of what's the difference in potency of cannabis in different cities in Europe and one city in Brazil. And then they correlated that with the adjusted incidence rates of admissions to emergency rooms for psychotic behavior. So that green line is the potency and the yellow line is the admission rates. And then you can see that if it's more potent, there's higher rates of admission for the most part. There are other factors involved with things like this about, diet, weather, genetics, et cetera, that they try to tease out. But you can see exceedingly high rates of admission for psychotic disorders in places with high potency. So London has much higher rate than the potency would predict. And that suggests that there are more factors than just the potency. And those factors, of course, the genetics of the population, how frequent the use is, not just the potency, what other substances are used in a given society, how much alcohol and amphetamine use, hallucinogenics, then the socioeconomics of that particular area. I mean, embedded in that data is all kinds of interesting stuff. Things like also exposure to violence, climate changes, diet. These are all important ideas, but there still is that, what you can see is the relationship between potency of the drug and higher rates of psychotic admissions to hospitals. So again, the data comes from all different sources. I'm just listing them for you if you want to sort of get into it. But my own experience is that over 80% of admitted psychotic patients have been using cannabis. Not just occasionally, but actually using it a great deal. And again, when we admit people for substance use, we now, if we study them carefully, find more and more psychotic symptoms. And then there's other data. Now this, to me, if you can help focus on it a little bit, it seems busy, right? But this is from Ontario. So this is data from Canada. So Canada is a country of 41 million people. It's a little bigger than our state of California. And this is Ontario, which has a population a little bigger than the state of New York. And they, because of the way their health system is organized, they can follow admissions to emergency rooms in the whole province, which we can't do things like that. We can't collect data like this in the United States, right? And what you have is the bottom line that's more violet or blue is the adult admissions over time starting in 2010. And then the upper line is, young people, say from 15 to 20 odd years of age. The early part of that curve is before the legalization of recreational cannabis use. Then the curve in young people begins to go up markedly in terms of, is they're measuring emergency room visits, all right? And I'll go into the details of it. Begins to go up as the government decides to decriminalize, right? And then they do something else after 2020, which is also when the COVID epidemic is. So there's a co-variant there. Then they commercialize, and there is another jump. So the rates of ER visits for severe reactions to cannabis keep going up over time as access to cannabis in all of Canada, but the state is from Ontario. I marked this in red so you can see something. If you look, this is pre-legalization to commercialization. Just look at that. Psychosis rates, the percent change in psychotic behavior of people being taken into emergency rooms on cannabis goes up 40%. That's a big jump. And this is very recent. You're talking about something that's happening in the last 4 years. This slide is placed into the same setting. There's different curves, okay? That middle curve is the curve for cannabis again. The higher curve is the methamphetamine curve. That also is going up. So nobody's legalizing methamphetamine. No one is commercializing methamphetamine. But that curve then follows the increase in availability and use of cannabis in Ontario. The lower one is cocaine. So cocaine doesn't do that. So there's some cocaine is in some ways is a weaker agonist than methamphetamine. So there's a interaction you can almost see between these two drugs, which I think becomes significant. Again, I'm using the Canadian data because it parses it out in a time frame that would make sense to us in this country. All right. Now you could say, okay, well, these are people who use cannabis and then they have episodes that bring them into the hospital. But what are the real background rates? What are the real rates of change? So if we focus on the idea of schizophrenia, and if you look on the second line, transition years, or transition in 3 years after, presentation, there's that little number on the side there on the far right that says 0.1%. That's your background incidence rate of the general population turning schizophrenic over time, 0.1%. But that's a compound rate that eventually will have a rate that'll go up, prevalence rates, say, of 1.2% in a population over time. So that's your change, say, per year in a particular population. That in the boxes next to it, it says percentages of 26%. That's how that rate changes with exposure to cannabis. Again, that's an enormous change. But again, those are in people who seem to carry a sensitivity. Can you make a judgment about how many people are really, really sensitive, right? How will the numbers in the population really, really change? Well, this gives you one hint, which is, you see the red in the far right. So males in their teenage to young adult years, say 14 to 24, you have rates of conversion of 40% of those who have been admitted to a hospital with a reaction to cannabis that caused psychotic symptoms to appear. All right. You also have high rates in anybody who presents to the ER with a psychotic episode. And then you even have increased rates, that's the third one from the right, if they don't have a psychotic episode, right? So that's just not 4 times because it's one, so it's like 12 times the rates. So there is increasing degrees of vulnerability. A 40% increase is an enormous change in risk profile. Historically, women, young girls especially, don't show as much psychosis as young men do. So the curve to the right gives you a sense that they're separated in terms of the incidence rates for 100,000. They're not as many, not as severe, right? If you look to the curve to the right, and again, this is what's changing because with that on the x-axis over there, right? That's over years. So you notice that in 1920, the rates of hospitalization for schizophrenia in young women is now meeting the same rates as young men. To the right, you're not going to see it because because those people have already passed through that critical period of exposure when you're young, when you're still a teenager. What should happen if they continue to follow these graphs, these numbers, that blue line on the right over years, because we're only 2 years ahead of it and they haven't collected and collated the data for the previous 2 years. So you can see something happening. I call this a really disturbing curve, right? Now, this is to point out that you follow these things over time. So this is the data from Scandinavia. So I jumped from the Canadian data to the Scandinavian data, all right? The Scandinavian data is much more detailed. Eventually, it'll it'll answer a lot of questions. But that series of curves on the left shows you changing vulnerability depending on what substances have been abused, right? So there's something about cannabis that is much more dangerous, much more potent in inducing schizophrenic changes. It doesn't do that to bipolar. It doesn't cause transformation into bipolar, even though that curve looks like it does, because that curve goes from 0 to 10 along the axis, right? Not 0 to 50. So the curve on the right would fit into that first little box on the curve on the left. So I had to describe it since they don't present it like that, because they were trying to tease out different data. That, to me, again, is fascinating, right? So there's more schizophrenia induction and not necessarily that much more bipolar induction. And this just shows that. So the bipolar induction curve over 20 years is much lower than the schizophrenia induction curve, which is on my screen is the red line. And there's these also are Danes and Finns are doing this work. They have all kinds of complex computer programs to try to tease out the data. But they say roughly, I think it's 32% of patients who have had a substance-induced psychotic episode of any kind convert to either a diagnosis of bipolar disorder or schizophrenia over the next 2 decades. Well, that's 20 years. How do you make sense of that? But most of it occurs in the first couple of years. So young people, and in their data, especially young men who start using cannabis, ages say 14, 15, 16, 17, as they reach their end of their teenage years and the beginning of their 20s, begin to show high rates of schizophrenia. The highest conversions are those who use cannabis, but no one is just using cannabis. The people are using multiple drugs. So again, they're presenting an enormous risk. Now they try to make sense of it statistically by doing, again, complex analyses of all their data, because they have the data on family histories, they have the genetics of the families of these young people coming from families where there's high rates of schizophrenia or other things. Are they victims of violence? Have they been involved in accidents? So they model in this, and they still, when they do this, the curves separate. Women go up to their time of 2022. The men are going up at a higher rate. But I think back to the curve that frightens me, which is that if women, young girls, begin to use cannabis more and more, that they will begin to share the same risk as men do, right? So this is, again, I don't see this as a good thing at all. And I'll try to get into it because we're living within it. When they tease out their data, when they give it to the statisticians, the data coming out of Scandinavia says that 15% of the cases of young people showing schizophrenia might have been prevented if they weren't using cannabis. And that the preventable cases may ultimately become as high as 25 to 30%. So if the background rate in the country was over 1% of the population is schizophrenic, when it compounds over time, they're going to have a schizophrenia rate of over 1.3 to 1.4 going forward. Well, think about that's thousands of people in a small country like Denmark. What would it be like in a small city? Or what would it be like in a large city like New York? In their data, the males are more susceptible, but the women are affected too. They don't think it's genetic because they can tease out the genetic factors. They think it is a major modifiable risk factor for schizophrenia, especially in males. So that means they're declaring it a mental health problem. And the Canadians are doing the same thing, saying that allowing cannabis to be generally available, especially to young people, is a major mental health problem. Now I'm going to say, okay, you made the argument, but your initial slide said stimulants. The stimulants do the same thing. There's a preponderance of data that people using large dosages of amphetamines coming out of Asia can induce psychotic states, and the psychotic states can be irreversible, and that they're indistinguishable from schizophrenia. So that stimulant use has been used as how to study the induction of schizophrenia and what the underlying disorder might be biologically as part of the whole theory of schizophrenia being a disorder of the dopamine system, because the amphetamines are dopamine agonists, dopamine stimulants. One of the papers in the journal I've sent you the link to is from McLean Hospital, showing that there's probably a dose response to this, looking at all the admissions through the Harvard system over the last years, that there was a very, very large number of cases that they're exposed to stimulants, often prescribed by physicians, especially Adderall, that converted to psychotic states. Ritalin was much less likely to do that, which is a relief that doesn't happen as often. But again, the stimulants can do enormous damage. So if I showed you some of these slides from all these other people, the rates of psychosis to people on stimulants are up several-fold. The violence rates are also up several-fold. Suicidality is up 4 times to people who, than the normal population of people who use stimulants, and also the rates of depression. You don't have to go over all of these things, but just if you want to look at them at some point, you have to try to tease out lots of data. The American data, again, is not, we don't collect data nationally or even within cities in a clear way, because of our healthcare system isn't a single organized system. But we have tons of data. You can actually get on the internet and download these things. The data substance use among adults alone was 211 pages. So we had to download this and look through the data for adults and look through the data for children. So that's like 400 pages of text. And I pulled out some interesting things. So I'm a New Yorker. You can tell by my accent, and the dorm, part of the dorm is in New York. There's about 450,000 teenagers, plus or minus 3,000, supposedly in New York right now. So that's the ages of kids who are mostly in high school. There's, with each cohort of 4 years, the numbers of girls, females, increases over the numbers of boys, which is interesting. Now, in the old days, maybe they would have been drafted, but that's not true anymore. I mean, there is a very, very high rate of overdose deaths, and also deaths due to unintended accidents in our region, all right? And the major cause of death in young people in the Northeast is unintended accidents. And then, quite remarkable, there were 6,000 overdose deaths in the city, all right? The number of 20% also of all the deaths of young people in the city were due to violent assault. I guess that's also called murder. But New York City isn't so bad. The murder rate in New York City is 6 per 100,000. The murder rate in Baltimore is over 57 per 100,000. The murder rate in Chicago is 23 per 100,000. However, the estimates of cannabis use in New York City among high schoolers is over 50%. And in New York City, there are cannabis dispensaries, and New York City has a problem with illegal cannabis dispensaries that are not closed down by the police because they feel they can't deal with them. And there's arguments going on in New York about what to do about that. Now, to try to add to that, so you have young people using cannabis. On college campuses, there are also young people prescribed stimulants, and stimulants are generally taken. I mean, why would you do that together? Because still they help each other in some way with the side effects. But 50% of young people in high school and college in New York City are using cannabis regularly. And so that's young people in that vulnerable period, say age 15, 14 to 17, both male and female. 50% of the psychiatric admissions in the city are now for schizophrenia. Again, they can't really track it the way they can in Sweden, but I think something is happening. I found one interesting bit of data, which is that on young people, so teenagers covered in on insurance programs that are administered by the government. So then 47% of teenagers are prescribed stimulants. So now that's not 47% of the 450,000 kids. I couldn't get the number on the exact numbers to pick up the numbers, but if you talk to child psychiatrists, they will say that between 40 and 50% of their practices of children in the metropolitan area are being treated with stimulants for various disorders, usually learning problems, etc. So I think the large cities of the United States are about to be impacted in a major way, and it'll be obvious. Doctors are taught to think in terms of 2 hits or 3 hits. Like, you develop cancer because you have an underlying vulnerability, you're exposed to some toxin, and those 2 things together start a process, all right? So I've been thinking about this in terms of the multiple hits in our own society of our young people. We have a great deal of stress. We have exposure to huge numbers of them to cannabis, exposure to stimulants. We have a background of violence in some of the big cities of background of violence, non-specific stresses, socioeconomic stresses. We have a failing educational system in many schools, right? These are the things that just ran through my head watching what was going on around me. There are other things that could be happening because these drugs can induce seizure disorders. So we may be seeing subclinical seizures. I think the COVID epidemic had terrible effects on our young people and on the educational system. And that the COVID virus does things to the brain. I could go on and on about that. But to me, these are really, really critical and important changes that are going on and have to be addressed in some way. We have a culture with enormous vulnerability, right? There's great expectation and great demand. As I said, the COVID epidemic has had, I think, real changes. And so I want to share with you some speculation. When COVID began to hit, we also began to see more psychosis, which was unresponsive. In other words, we couldn't get it to change. We had cases that one medicine after another failed. The symptoms would get worse. And we couldn't seem to break through it. We had increased admission rates and again, increased rates of intensity of illness. So I began going back into my brain studies. Now, schizophrenia is a disorder of development in which there are changes in behavior, changes in relatedness to others, cognitive changes, interpersonal changes. So it's a disorder of the whole brain and the whole interacting person in the world. Cannabis does some of the same things. So in schizophrenia, there's a disruption of the frontal lobes, which are involved in attention, but also the hippocampus, which is involved in memory and also emotional control with the amygdala. There's some degeneration found in the structures of the temporal lobe, which is where the hippocampus is. The cannabis damages those structures. It interferes with the parts of the brain which constantly regenerate. So the part of the brain in mammals that we think is important and constantly has regeneration is the hippocampus, and cannabis interferes with that. Amphetamines interfere with that part of the brain. They interfere with the regenerating parts of the brain. the cells which are in that part of the brain, that regenerate. When I was in medical school and in graduate school, they taught us that the brain of humans didn't regenerate over time. We now know that on each of the two hippocampi on either side of the brain, in humans, maybe 1,600 cells regenerate a day and eventually send off processes into the brain. So stress damages those systems. Exposure to toxic substances of various kinds will disrupt and destroy those systems. Cannabis, amphetamines can do that. So we have a population of young people living in an environment under enormous stress, which can damage those critical cell structures during the critical period of development and also a critical period of learning. And they are turning to substances that might actually accelerate those problems. Antidepressants, by the way, protect those systems. Not all antipsychotics do. And it might be that one of the reasons why we've been having to use more and more clozapine is one of the few drugs that actually protects those cells in the critical parts of the brain. I'm just going to skip a little bit. I've given you slides about some of this. I get a little bit, I guess, almost overly political about this because I think it's a real political failure, okay? But I gave you some slides on my thoughts about the hippocampus and some pictures of it in case you want it. And we see really interesting things now. Sometimes we see young people come in that nothing works for. So we have to we go searching for what's going on. This is actually a patient. Dr. Cavalier is one of my collaborators. He's an incredible neuroradiologist. So this patient, nothing worked, even in high dose, but he was still very, very bright man, young man, And we took very detailed pictures of his hippocampus. This is actually it, and where the arrow is, there's something wrong with the cells in those structures. This is a young man who was diagnosed as having ADD on very, very high dosages of Adderall, more and more anxious, began smoking lots of cannabis, and then becomes more and more psychotic over the years. And we actually could see, I can't see it, I'll confess, but Sal Cavalier can see it and shows me all the slides of it. And so we changed his medication regimen to treat him for what we thought was a form of possible epilepsy in the deep structures. I mean, we now have more and more patients that come in that we have on anti-epileptic drugs as well as the antipsychotic drugs. So I've given you slides about looking at the pictures, but also my kind of musing on this. And this, the other thing with all these, the kids can't believe when you tell them that cannabis is not good for them because they feel better on the cannabis because they feel more relaxed. That sense of relaxation, they can't match up with if they may be in some way interfering with their overall cognitive capacity in a way that is slowly appearing over years. Because if you look back or think back to those curves I showed you from Scandinavia, those changes are taking place over years. It isn't like one episode and then you're gone. But if you've had one episode, something begins to happen. It's a slow progression over time. And I think that's why it's not being responded to in the way it might be, because it's sneaking up on us. I've given you a bunch of my musings on it. I think it would be better for us to have some back and forth with questions, okay? Instead of my going into the details of what I think is going on. But again, I stress to you, embedded in the data from Canada is the vulnerability of young women. I I'm really concerned about this. These young people will eventually present and they'll look like classic schizophrenics. They'll meet the criteria of DSM-5. They'll look like, Kraepelinian schizophrenics. In that they'll have the degenerative process of withdrawal. They'll show first-rank Schneiderian symptoms, bizarre thoughts. I misspelled Delilah. Oh dear. I didn't catch it. Okay. But I think they're actually more cognitively intact behind the illness. And because I think that if you do intelligence testing on them, you find that they're more intact. And I think they're salvageable. And I think that we have to figure this out and salvage these kids. But part of salvaging them has to be not just putting them on drugs, but getting them away from, the dangerous substances. I don't know how, in my city, we continue to have cannabis dispensaries in neighborhoods where kids are going to school. Okay, I think we've made a big mistake here. And I think the adults in our culture have to take some responsibility for what they're doing. What I put together to talk to you about is Catherine Petstory, Dr. Doherty, and Dr. Mann, and Nancy Rowe and others have helped me put this together. And I have a medical student trying to go through all of those books and all that data to put it in slides that make sense. So I think we're going to try to do other presentations in the future with our neuroradiology friends. But I think I want to open this up to chat. So what do I do, Nancy? Stop sharing. Stop sharing. Stop talking too. Did I get in time, Amanda?
You got it. You did it. You did great. You did great. Thank you so much. There's a lot of activity in the chat, so I am definitely going to start throwing out some questions, Dr. Marotta, if that's okay. And I'm going to try to consolidate them as best I can because a lot of people are asking some questions that are quite similar or related. There's a handful of people who in the chat have been asking about how researchers are able to control for the possibility that of individuals who might be predisposed to the development of psychotic disorders. Those individuals are also more likely to abuse substances like cannabis as a coping mechanism to manage pre-threshold symptoms. So, how do we account for that in the research? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. Well, that's a big thing that the Scandinavians try to do statistically. And one of my medical students was doing research for 6 years and a statistician, and I try to get him to explain these things to me. Some of them are beyond me. It's called the problem of reverse causation.
Right.
So it's something about the vulnerability to schizophrenia which will lead you to substance abuse of certain kinds. And of course, my friends who were at Cornell, some of them, they had the idea of self-medication, right? That I think that ties into this also. I think it's like also, and I think those things are possible. I mean, but you try to tease them out with large groups of data and doing analysis, right? I see something else, which is I'm sort of obsessed with the idea of anosognosia, which is the denial of illness. And that once you find a substance which helps you do the things you think you need to do, which is to stay calm or to be more productive, you will not see the danger in it, and you will change your way of viewing it. I mean, alcoholics tell you they don't drink, right? And so many of the young people we admit who are using cannabis they think cannabis is really what helps them.
Right.
And I think if you have a predisposition to a psychotic disorder early on, I think it does help you. But Scandinavians feel that it's not just people who have the genetic vulnerability, because they can follow the family histories too. And they try to tease out who's been hit over the head, who had seizures when they were young. that slide with all that busyness in it is a lot of that is their attempts to pull all that out. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I've been surprised over and over again in my life, by what is and what is not. I mean, I was at Woodstock. I lived in a commune, so I didn't think there was anything dangerous about these things. Uh, and yet now I see it quite differently. But I
Mhm.
see a lot of social facilitation. What's frightening to me, because it means it's our sin. It's the sin of my generation, right? They're thinking that everything is hunky dory. It's a terrible burden to leave on your children and grandchildren. That's how I look at it. So, mea culpa. Oh,
Yeah, suggest that as well, as that, in looking at their research and in doing research, you're able to sort of parse out
yeah,
individuals who have these factors that make them, um, you know, more at risk for a predisposed schizophrenia diagnosis from people who don't have those risk factors and are just, solely using a lot of cannabis and then present in ERs with psychotic symptoms versus somebody whose mother had a schizophrenia diagnosis, or grandparent or two grandparents, what have you.
yeah. So they just try to tease it out step by step.
Correct.
In the world, what I see things in a different way, which is I see somebody and as a story, and I try to make sense of the story of that individual case, like the one I told you about. And I saw someone today who turned out he had seizures. They thought he was, just strange, right? But they only discovered he had seizures when they put depth electrodes in his brain because his behavior was so bizarre, and he had to be in hospital, right, for weeks for them to tease that out, to make sense of what to do. And the treatment of those cases is incredibly complex. So only research teams and clinical teams with the highest level of technical ability can even do that, right? I mean, for Salkavali to point out that cell grouping that was misplaced, he had to have a brand new MRI with a new set of computers and play with it. He had to set that up to. He had to say, "What do you think might be going on?" And I have this obsession about the hippocampal regeneration. So he turns this machine to look for that. Well, when someone sends you for regular scanning MRI, they're not going to do that, right? I had to ask them, take these cases, search for that thing, and then they're going to have to convince who's going to pay for that. The insurance companies are going to pay for my, curiosity. You
Yeah,
know,
I love that idea too of, like, I think a lot of us working specifically with the younger, population, with adolescents and young adults, can certainly attest to the fact that anecdotally, subjectively, what we are seeing is more and more clients who are presenting with psychotic symptoms, who also have been smoking. Marijuana on a daily basis, and who don't have these high risk factors for a psychotic diagnosis. We're just seeing more and more of that in practice. There was
yeah,
another.
I
Sorry.
think it's a real phenomena, and I don't think
Yeah.
it's just, but I don't think we're out searching for them. My class, I have a
No.
reputation for searching for bad things. I don't, but I think, I was just scraping on the surface and seeing that, because we're trained to just put things into bins easily to treat as many as we can. And these are very complicated, and you're looking into strange histories, but it's everywhere now. I mean,
Yeah.
we're really faced with a problem.
Yeah. Agree. There was another question that came in. Hold on, let me just scroll to it. Somebody was asking about, okay, are there times when you would try to reintroduce a stimulant after a psychotic episode?
Oh yeah, I mean, I try not to think. Well, since how many are we? A couple hundred of us, so we're all good friends, right? Uh, I mean, I don't think in terms of diagnoses. I think in terms of symptom clusters. and possible underlying processes. So my objective with those, like one of the groups of kids we've been working with, I'm sorry, in their 20s, is to get them back into life. So even if I can control psychotic symptoms, if they're not, can't focus, can't motivate, they're not going to go back to school, they're not going to ever graduate, right? So my overall objective is going to be to have them have normal lives. We've had patients pass through here who are doctors. I have a whole bunch of them who are social workers working with the dual diagnosis population. I mean, that's the joy of my life to see that.
Yep.
And um, I have boys who are engineers. I can't believe they could go to engineering school. And girls who are social workers and boys who, I shouldn't use that language, I'm too old. So to make that happen, I have them on sometimes bizarre combinations. I don't use Adderall, but I use Nuvigil or Provigil as a stimulant. I may use very low dose Ritalin, not because of the paper that came out 2 weeks ago, but because I'm just looking for something to make it work. We use clozapine, we use anti, sometimes mild, low doses of antidepressants mixed. We use all kinds of things. If we think the symptoms are of a certain kind, we use a lot of nickel, because we have to protect the people against seizures. I think part of what goes on is the brain gets changed in such a way as it has less internal inhibition drug exposure, and that's part of one of the ultimate theory of schizophrenia is that this regulation of dopamine and ketamine leads to breakdown of inhibition, of GABA systems. And maybe that's what it is, but it's not simple. These are exceedingly complex systems. And I can't pay attention to all of them, but I do really think about these young people who seem to me to be so intelligent, and yet are failing to be able to carry out their lives, right? And that's why we try to eventually come up with something to help them navigate. I can't use the computer. I mean, I need to take a stimulant, a cup of coffee to turn the damn thing on. And God, it's so complicated, the education system now, and all the skills they must have. I just, being a New Yorker, the idea of 50% of the kids on the street stoned, but it feels like that because I walk down the street and all I smell is marijuana.
Yeah, it is. The culture has changed tremendously in terms of cannabis use with kids veering away from alcohol use, moving towards cannabis use. I want to get one more question in really quickly because I think this is a really important one, especially to people who do direct practice with this population. And this is a question that has to do with harm reduction and harm reduction conversations that take place with our clients who will say, who have presented having experienced psychotic episodes, who have been smoking a lot of cannabis, and they say, well, can't I just smoke less? And wanting for you to put the stamp of approval on more of a harm reduction approach. What are your thoughts on that?
I just went through this a few days ago with somebody, a boy I love. I want to kill him. He's telling me he's a graduate student. He's a brilliant guy, right? But he cannot, he will die. I know he will die if he uses, right? And so I have to just say it. I mean, my collaborator, Sophia Walker, who's collecting all these strange cases, we presented them at the meetings in Europe this spring. We're begging him to not tell us this bullshit. I mean, denial of illness is one thing. To me, it's an embracing of illness, right? Like, he doesn't see it that way, but he's not the only young person like that. And again, the culture says it's okay. I mean, and I'm when I was younger, sure, we all thought nothing could kill us, right? Nothing would harm us. I think,
Right.
And then you get older and your Weltanschauung, your view of the world, how you feel, it changes. And I'm a grandfather now, and I just see danger everywhere to children. So maybe it's Um, but it's my work, it's my life's work, right? But something changed, and I'll just say quickly, and it was right in front of me even when I was younger because I was trained at New York Hospital at Cornell, Payne Whitney. It was, in a place where the people were wealthy and patients were from upper middle class and upper class families. And then we were also working at St. Luke's on 116th Street. So we were maybe 3 miles apart, right? Roughly, right? And what presented at St. Luke's was so remarkably different than what presented, at 68th Street. So 114th Street to 68th Street, a different world totally. And psychosis was just rampant, totally rampant uptown. But when I was really young, at that at NYU, when I was undergraduate, before I even went to graduate school, and I was actually saw real bipolar cases, like in a book. Nah, never saw a real bipolar case uptown because they all were smoking marijuana. They were all using, cocaine and other things, and it was, and the the wastage, the death rates are enormous, and that's why if you look at the bins by 4 years of women versus men, the number of men in New York City keeps going down, even among the young men, not the old men dying early, right? The number of surviving younger men, drops by 10 to 15,000 every 4 years. Where are they going?
Yeah. Yeah.
They're going down the tubes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marotta. This was really such a wonderful presentation. And I know people are really engaged. People are still going back and forth amongst themselves in the chat, which we love to see. We're looking forward to putting together more presentations on this really important topic. Please keep an eye out in your inbox for the event valuation, which you will have to complete prior to getting your CEs or CME credits. And again, thank you, Dr. Marotta. We look forward
Yeah.
to seeing everybody next time.
Thanks
Have
a
a
lot.
good afternoon.
Bye bye.